How many times have you found yourself looking at someone else's life, thinking they have it better than you? How often do you scroll through your phone, or maybe you're at work or a family gathering, and it just feels like everyone else has it figured out? We've all been there. You see someone with a bigger house, a nicer car, a seemingly perfect relationship, and you start to wonder, what am I doing wrong? It's human nature, right? We compare. From the time we're young, we're taught to measure ourselves against others. Who's the fastest in the class? Who's the most popular? Who's getting the best grades? And that carries over into adulthood. We constantly look outside ourselves to figure out if we're doing okay, if we're successful, if we measure up. But why? Why do we feel so drawn to compare ourselves to others? Why do we constantly look outside ourselves for validation? It's easy to see why. We live in a world that tells us to keep up. Keep up with the trends, keep up with the latest success stories, keep up with what everyone else is doing. Society has a way of making us feel like if we're not ahead, if we're not where someone else is, we're behind. But here's what I want you to think us. Is that really true? Is it true that just because someone else has something you don't, it means you're lacking? Does it mean you're not doing enough? I want you to really sit with that for a moment. Now take a second and think about the last time you compared yourself to someone else. Maybe it was a friend who got that promotion you've been hoping for. Maybe it was a neighbor who seems to have the perfect family. What did that comparison do to you? Did it make you feel energized, motivated, or did it leave you feeling a little defeated, like you're never quite enough? When we focus on what others are doing, we lose sight of our own progress. We stop paying attention to our own path, our own growth, because we're so busy trying to measure ourselves against someone else's life. But their life isn't your life. Their story isn't your story. Have you ever noticed that no matter how well you're doing, there's always someone who seems to be doing better? And doesn't that get exhausting? It's like running a race where you don't even know the finish line, where the goalpost keeps moving because someone else's success becomes your measuring stick. That's not how growth works. That's not how happiness works. Happiness isn't found in what others have. It's found in what you have. It's found in where you are right now. The problem with looking outward for validation is that it's never enough. You'll always find someone else who seems to be doing more or who has something you don't. And if you're always chasing someone else's version of success, you're going to miss your own. So why do we do this? Why do we fall into this habit of constantly comparing? Part of it is because we're wired that way. It's a habit, and habits are hard to break. But just because something is common doesn't mean it's helpful. And I want to remind you today that you don't need to be like anyone else. You don't need to keep up with anyone else's life. The only person you need to keep up with is the person you were yesterday. That's it. Your race is with yourself, not with anyone else. Think about it. The energy you spend watching someone else's life unfold, what if you took that same energy and invested it in yourself? What if instead of comparing, you celebrated where you are right now, even if it's not where you want to be just yet? You see, we fall into this trap of thinking that everyone else has it easier, that their path is smoother. But what we often don't realize is that we're comparing our behind the scenes with their highlight reel. You don't see the struggles, the setbacks, the sacrifices they've made. You only see the outcome, and that outcome doesn't tell the whole story. How does it make you feel when you compare yourself to others? And is it really worth it? Because the truth is, the only person who can define your success, the only person who can determine your worth is you. Let's stop giving so much weight to what everyone else is doing and start focusing on what we're doing. Because when you focus on yourself, on your own growth, that's when real progress happens. That's when you start to see what's possible for your life. Imagine waking up every day, not worrying about what others think, not feeling the need to measure yourself against anyone else's life, just being fully present in your own. What would that feel like? What would that look like? Have you ever noticed that no matter how well you're doing, there's always someone who seems to be doing better? It's almost like life has this way of showing us someone else's achievements, right when we're starting to feel good about our own progress. You've been working hard, making strides, and then, bam! You see someone else who seems to be miles ahead, and suddenly everything you've done feels small, doesn't it? It's like the joy of your own accomplishments disappears the moment you start comparing them to someone else's. That's the trap. That's the comparison trap. And let me tell you, it's one of the biggest. You could be having the best day. You're proud of something you've done, feeling good about your progress. Then you scroll through social media and there it is. Someone got a promotion, or they bought a new house, or they're on a vacation that looks straight out of a magazine. And just like that, your contentment vanishes. It's not that what you achieved suddenly has less value, but it feels that way, doesn't it? That's the dangerous part. It's not that their success takes away from yours, but when you compare it, shift. Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we let comparison rob us of the joy we've earned? Think about it for a second. When we compare, what are we really doing? We're taking someone else's life, usually just the parts they want us to see, and holding it up against our own, but we're only comparing the shiny parts of their story. We don't see the struggles, the doubts, the sacrifices they've made to get where they are. We see the end result, and we measure it against where we are now in the middle of our journey. It's an unfair comparison, but it's one we make all the time. Social media, for example, has turned this into a daily habit. We're constantly bombarded with curated versions of other people's lives. And let's be honest, nobody posts about their bad days, their failures, or their moments of doubt. What we see is the highlight reel, the perfect snapshot of a life that looks effortless. But life isn't like that. What we don't see are the endless hours of hard work, the sleepless nights, the personal struggles that everyone goes through. Yet when we scroll, it's easy to feel like we're the only ones struggling while everyone else is effortlessly thriving. It doesn't just stop with social media, does it? It happens at work too. You might be doing great in your career, but then you notice someone else gets promoted, or they seem to be excelling in areas where you feel stuck. And suddenly, you start to question yourself. Why aren't I moving up as fast as them? What am I doing wrong? But here's the thing, you don't know their full story. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes for them, just like they don't know what's happening with you. You both have your own paths, but comparison makes it feel like you're competing on the same track. And let's not forget family. Family expectations can make this comparison game even harder. Maybe you've got a sibling who seems to have it all figured out, or a cousin who always seems to be the one making everyone proud. It's so easy to fall into that mindset of thinking, why can't I be more like them? But here's the thing. You're not supposed to be like them. You're supposed to be you. Your value, your worth isn't defined by how you stack up against someone else's accomplishment. How does this constant comparison make you feel at the end of the day? When you spend all your time looking at someone else's life, how do you feel about your own? It leaves you drained, doesn't it? It leaves you distracted from your own growth because instead of focusing on what you need to do to improve, you're fixated on what someone else is doing. Instead of celebrating your progress, you're too busy measuring it against someone else's. And when that happens, we lose sight of what really matters. We stop seeing our own potential. We get so caught up in trying to match someone else's success that we forget about our own path, our own journey. But here's the truth. You can't run someone else's race. You can only run your own. When you focus too much on what others are doing, you blind yourself to your own progress. Think about it. Have you ever had a moment where you were so focused on someone else's success that you completely missed how far you've come? Maybe you've been working hard on something. Maybe it's your career, your health, or a personal goal, and you've made significant progress. But instead of acknowledging that, instead of taking a moment to appreciate how far you've come, you look over at someone else and think, I'm not doing enough. It's a terrible feeling, isn't it? And the worst part is it's not true. You are doing enough. But comparison blinds you to that. It blinds you to the fact that you're on your own path at your own pace. It blinds you to the fact that progress isn't about being the best or the fastest. It's about being better than you were yesterday. No one else's success takes away from yours. Someone else's victory doesn't mean you've lost. But when you compare, it can feel that way. It can feel like their win somehow diminishes what you've achieved, but it doesn't. Your path is yours and theirs is theirs. They're not the same, and they're not supposed to be. So why do we insist on comparing them? The truth is, comparison is a habit. And like any habit, it can be changed. But first, you have to recognize when you're doing it. The next time you find yourself falling into the comparison trap, ask yourself, is this helping me or hurting me? More often than not, the answer will be that it's hurting you. It's distracting you from your own growth. It's taking away your energy and your focus. So what can you do instead? Instead of comparing, focus on your own progress. Look at where you were a year ago, 6 months ago, even a week ago. Have you made progress? Have you grown even just a little? That's what matters. It's not about being better than someone else. It's about being better than you were before. When you stop comparing, something amazing happens. You free yourself from the need to keep up with everyone else. You start to focus on what truly matters, your own growth, your own potential. And that's when real change happens. That's when you start to feel fulfilled because you're no longer chasing someone else's version of success. You're creating your own. So the next time you catch yourself in the comparison trap, take a step back. Remind yourself that their path is not your path. Their success is not your success. And that's okay. You're right where you need to be. And the only person you should be comparing yourself to is the person you were yesterday. So here we are. We've talked about the comparison trap, how it steals your joy, how it blinds you to your own progress. But where do you go from here? What's the solution? It's simpler than you might think, but also more profound. Focus on yourself. Now, I know that sounds almost too easy, right? But sometimes the simplest ideas are the most powerful. When you shift your focus from what everyone else is doing and place it back on yourself, on your own growth, your own improvement. That's it. I want to share a story with you about someone who did just that. Let's call him Mark. Mark was someone who, like many of us, spent years comparing himself to others. At work, he constantly looked around at his colleagues. He saw who was getting promoted, who was making more money, who had a bigger house or a nicer car. And every time he compared himself, it drained him. No matter how hard he worked, it never felt like enough because in his mind, someone else was up. He would come home after work exhausted, not because of the job itself, but because of this constant mental game of trying to keep up with everyone else. Sound familiar? He'd scroll through social media and feel like he was falling behind, and it didn't just affect his work life. It crept into his relationships, his health, even his hobbies. Everything felt like a competition. But one day something changed. He hit a point where he was so tired of feeling like he wasn't enough. He decided to try something different. He made a choice, a simple one, but it changed everything. He decided to stop looking at what others were doing completely. He deleted social media for a while, stopped worrying about who was getting ahead at work, and instead, he turned all that energy inward. He started focusing on himself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that said, I'm going to improve me for me. Every day, he asked himself, what can I do today that's going to make me a little bit better than I was yesterday? He wasn't trying to make huge changes all at once. It wasn't about overhauling his life overnight. He just wanted to make small, consistent improvements. At first, those changes seemed insignificant. He started waking up a little earlier each day to read or exercise before work. He spent a little more time planning his day, getting clear on what he wanted to accomplish. He began to set personal goals, not based on what anyone else was doing, but based on where he wanted. Slowly but surely, things started to shift. And here's what's interesting. Once he stopped focusing on everyone else, he actually started to excel in his own life. At work, his performance improved, not because he was trying to outdo anyone, but because he was more focused, more energized. He was no longer wasting his mental energy worrying about what others were doing. He was fully invested in his own progress. His relationships improved too, because he wasn't coming home drained and frustrated. He had more patience, more presence, and that made a difference in how he connected with others. But here's the thing that really stood out. As Mark focused on himself, his confidence grew. Not because he was better than anyone else, but because he was becoming better than the person he used to be. And that's a powerful feeling. You see, when you stop comparing and start investing in yourself, you begin to see your own potential. You stop seeing life as a competition and start seeing it as an opportunity for growth. And it's not about making giant leaps overnight. It's about those small, consistent steps. The kind that don't always feel like much in the moment, but over time, they add up in ways you can't imagine. Now, let me ask you something. What if, starting today, you focused on improving just one yourself each day? Think about that for a second, just one. That doesn't sound like much, does it? But imagine what would happen if you did that every day. In a week, you'd be 7 better than you were. In a month, 30. And in a year, you would be 365 better than you are right now. Can you visualize what that would look like for you? Think about it. What area of your life do you want to improve? Is it your career, your health, your relationships? What if every day you focused on making just a small improvement in that area? Maybe it's as simple as learning something new, or spending a few extra minutes each day on a hobby that brings you joy. Maybe it's setting a small goal at work, or dedicating a little more time to your personal relationships. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be consistent. And I promise you, if you make that commitment to yourself to improve just a little bit each day, you will start to see changes. Not immediately, but over time. And when you look back after a few months or a year, you'll realize how far you've come. Here's what I want you to take away from this. You don't need to compete with anyone else to be successful. You don't need to look at what others are doing to measure your own worth. Your potential isn't tied to someone else's progress. Your potential is yours, and it's limitless. When you focus on yourself, you unlock that potential. You start to realize that the only person you need to impress, the only person you need to keep up with, is yourself. And when you do that, everything changes. You stop worrying about what everyone else is doing, and instead, you become fully invested in your own growth, your own path. And that's where real success comes from. That's where real happiness comes from. What if, starting today, you focused on improving just on yourself each day? How would that change your life in a year? What would that version of you look like? Can you see it? Can you feel what it would be like to wake up a year from now knowing that every single day you've made progress, that you've invested in yourself in a way that's paid off in ways you couldn't have imagined? That's the power of focusing on yourself. That's the power of small, consistent changes. And it's available to you right now. All you have to do is make the choice. Stop looking at what everyone else is doing and start investing in yourself. Why is it that when we focus on ourselves, everything else starts to fall into place? It might seem counterintuitive at first, especially in a world that constantly tells us to keep an eye on what others are doing. But here's the truth. The most successful, fulfilled people aren't the ones who spend their time worrying about how they measure up to everyone else. They're the ones who, at some point, realize that the only thing they can truly control is themselves. Take a moment and think about someone who has made a big impact. Someone you admire, someone successful. What do they all have in common? I guarantee you their breakthrough moments didn't come when they were trying to chase what someone else had. No, it happened when they decided to focus on their own unique strengths, their own growth. It's not that they ignored the world around them. They just stopped letting it dictate their path. I once met a woman who had spent years working in a corporate job that she hated. Every day, she watched her colleagues climb the ladder, get raises, and win praise from the bosses. She spent so much of her energy trying to match their success, mimicking their strategies, hoping that if she did what they did, she would get the same results. But nothing worked. In fact, the more she tried to follow in their footsteps, the more frustrated she became. One day, she reached a breaking point. She realized she had been living someone else's life, chasing someone else's dream. So she made a bold decision. She stopped trying to keep up with her colleagues and started focusing on what made her. She started to ask herself, what do I really want? What makes me come alive? It was a question she had ignored for years. Once she made that shift, everything changed. She left her corporate job and started her own business, something she had always dreamed about but never had the courage to pursue. It wasn't easy at first, but because she was focused on her growth, on building something that aligned with her passion, She found a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. Her business grew, and before long, she was thriving in ways she never thought possible. She didn't get there by trying to outdo anyone else. She got there by focusing on herself, by asking, what can I control? What can I improve? The moment you stop chasing what others have and start investing in your own growth, you unlock a new level of success and happiness. It's not about keeping up with anyone. It's about keeping up with yourself. You ever felt like you were spinning your wheels, working harder and harder but not getting anywhere? Often, that happens because we're spending too much time worrying about what others are doing. We lose sight of what we're capable of because we're too busy watching someone else's story unfold. But here's the thing. Focusing on others distracts you from the one thing you can control, your own effort. And that's where the power is. Imagine two people starting from the same point. One is constantly looking around, worrying about how everyone else is doing. They're consumed by thoughts like, are they getting ahead of me? Am I falling behind? Now imagine the other person. Instead of looking around, they're focused solely on themselves. They're asking, how can I improve today? How can I get better, even by just a little? Who do you think progresses faster? Let's look at athletics. Think about the sprinter who, during a race, spends half the time looking over their shoulder to see how the competition is doing. They lose focus. They lose speed. And often they lose the race. Compare that to the sprinter who keeps their eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on their own pace, their own technique. They're the ones who cross the finish line first. The same is true in business. I remember hearing a story about an entrepreneur who spent years struggling to get his company off the ground. He was constantly looking at what other companies were doing, trying to mimic their strategies, always feeling like he was behind. He realized something important. His competitors weren't his problem. His focus was. So he made a shift. Instead of obsessing over what everyone else was doing, he turned his attention inward. He asked, what can I do to make my business unique? What value can I add that no one else can? And that's when things started to click. His company took off, not because he was chasing others, but because he was building something that was authentically his. Even in personal relationships, this holds true. Think about it. Have you ever been in a relationship where you constantly compared yourself to other couples? Maybe you thought, they seem happier than us, or they seem to have it all figured out. That kind of thinking doesn't bring you closer to your partner. In fact, it creates distance. But when you stop comparing and start focusing on what you can do to improve your relationship, that's when things start to shift. You stop worrying about how you measure up to others and start building a connection that works for you. When you focus on yourself, on what you can control, what you can improve, everything changes. You become more grounded, more centered, and more at peace with where you are. And here's the amazing part. That's when you start to see real growth. Because when you're not wasting energy on comparison, you can use that energy to push yourself forward. What could you accomplish if you stopped worrying about what others are doing? What if, instead of trying to match their success, you focus on creating your own? What if you poured all your energy into becoming the best version of you? The truth is, when you focus on yourself, you unlock a power that no one else can take away from you. You stop trying to live someone else's life and start living your own. And that's where the real breakthrough happens. Because success isn't about being better than someone else. It's about being better than you were yesterday. Well, let's get into something practical. We've talked about why focusing on yourself is powerful, how it unlocks your potential and allows you to move forward in ways you never thought possible. But I know what you might be thinking, okay, but how do I actually do that? Because let's face it, in a world full of distractions, it's easy to say, I'm going to focus on myself. But then what happens? You get pulled into social media, you overhear someone else's success story, or you fall into the same old patterns of comparing your life to others. So how do you break out of that? How do you make this shift stick? Let's start with something simple. One of the best ways to shift your focus inward is by building habits that serve you, habits that support your growth. And it doesn't have to be anything grand. In fact, it shouldn't be. The power lies in the small, consistent things you do every day. Take, for example, the idea of a daily routine. Think of your morning. How do you start your day? Is it reactive, scrolling through your phone, seeing what everyone else is up to before you've even had your first sip of coffee? Was it intentional? Because here's the truth. The way you start your day sets the tone for one simple habit that can immediately shift your focus is to create a morning routine that's centered on you. It could be as simple as taking 5 minutes to meditate, read something uplifting, or even just sit in silence and think about how you want to show up today. It's not about making huge changes right away. It's about carving out a little space that's just for you, where no one else's expectations or achievements are dictating how you feel about your life. Another powerful shift comes from setting daily goals. And I'm not talking about overwhelming, giant goals that leave you feeling defeated by the end of the day. I'm talking about small, specific actions you can take that move you closer to where you... Maybe it's spending 30 minutes learning a new skill or making a conscious effort to be more present in your relationships. The key is to set goals that are meaningful to you, not based on what someone else is doing. Here's something I want you to think about. Each of us has something unique to offer, but we dilute our energy when we're too busy looking at everyone else's plate. It's like being at a buffet, filling your plate with all kinds of things because you see other people eating them, only to realize that half of it isn't even what you wanted. But when you focus on your plate, what nourishes you, what satisfies you, you're not distracted by what everyone else is eating because you're content with what's on your plate. So how do you keep your focus on your own plate? Here's another practical step. Limit distractions. One of the biggest challenges we face today is the constant bombardment of information. Social media news, other people's opinions, it all pulls us away from what we're doing. If you're serious about focusing on yourself, take a break from the noise. That doesn't mean you have to delete all your accounts or go off the grid. But maybe for a set amount of time each day, you commit to stepping away from the comparisons and tuning into you. And finally, celebrate your small victories. One of the most powerful things you can do is to acknowledge your progress, no matter how small. Too often, we focus only on the big milestones, but those don't come every day. What comes every day are the little steps, the ones that over time lead to those big breakthroughs. So take time to reflect on your wins, however small they might seem. Did you keep a promise to yourself today? Did you take a step, no matter how small, toward your goal? Celebrate that. Because it's those small wins that build momentum. Realize it like this is when you stay in your lane, you get to where you're going faster and with less frustration. You're not constantly swerving, trying to keep up with everyone else. You're focused. You're consistent. And that's where real progress happens. Let me share another example. I knew a couple who wanted to improve their relationship. At first, they were so focused on comparing themselves to other couples, looking at what other people were doing, trying to figure out if they were measuring up. But that only made them feel disconnected. So they decided to stop. They stopped looking at what other couples were doing and started focusing on what they could do to strengthen their connection. They committed to spending just 15 minutes a day talking. No phones, no distractions, just being present with each other. And that small shift made all the difference. It wasn't about what anyone else was doing. It was about what worked for them. And because they focused on their own relationship, they grew stronger. They weren't trying to keep up with anyone else. They were focused on building something that mattered to them. Here's my challenge to you. What small step can you take today to focus on yourself? Maybe it's setting a goal that aligns with what you want. Maybe it's creating a daily routine that supports your growth. Maybe it's tuning out the distractions and tuning into your own progress. Whatever it is, commit to it and watch how, over time, those small steps lead to big changes. When you stop looking at what everyone else is doing and start investing in yourself, that's when you unlock your true potential. And that's where real success, real happiness, and real growth come from. It's not about keeping up with anyone else. It's about becoming the best version of yourself. And that starts with the small, consistent actions you take today. Let's talk about setbacks. Because even when you're focused on yourself, even when you're doing everything right, life happens. Things go wrong, plans fall apart, and you hit roadblocks that you didn't see coming. But the question is, how do you handle those moments? That's the difference. When you're focused on others, you quit when things get hard. When you're focused on yourself, you adapt, you pivot, you find a way forward because you know that the path to success is not a straight line. It's full of twists, turns, and detours. But you also know that every single one of those detours is part of your growth. So I want to ask you, how do you react to failure? Do you let it stop you, or do you use it as fuel to keep going? Think about it for a moment. What happens when you hit a roadblock? Do you get discouraged and start looking around, wondering why it seems so easy for everyone else? Or do you focus on what you can do to move forward? Because that choice, how you react in those moments, that's what separates those who succeed from those who give up. When you're focused on yourself, you understand that failure isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of the process. It's a part of the journey. It's not the end. It's just a lesson. And the sooner you can shift your mindset to see failure as feedback, the sooner you'll be able to turn those setbacks into stepping stones. I remember talking to a business owner who faced a major financial loss early on in her career. It was devastating. She could have easily walked away and said, well, I guess business isn't for me. But instead, she took a step back and asked herself, what can I learn from this? How can I do things differently next time? That mindset shift allowed her to rebuild stronger, and today, she runs a thriving, successful business. Not because she never faced failure, but because she knew how to use it to her advantage. The reality is, if you're focused on what everyone else is doing, you're going to see every setback as a failure. But if you're focused on your own growth, you're going to see setbacks as feedback, an opportunity to adjust, to learn, and to keep moving forward. How do you react to failure? Do you let it define you, or do you use it to propel you? The choice is yours. When you focus on yourself, on what you can control, you have the power to turn every setback into a stepping stone. It's not about never failing. It's about how you respond when you do. And if you can master that, if you can see failure not as an end, but as part of the process, you'll find that those setbacks aren't holding you back at all. They're shaping you. They're making you stronger, wiser, and more prepared for what's ahead. So the next time you face a challenge, don't look around at how everyone else is handling it. Look inward. Ask yourself, what can I take from this? How can I grow from this? Because that's where real progress happens. Not in avoiding setbacks, but in learning how to rise after them. Now let's think long-term for a moment. Imagine what your life would look like if, starting today, you focused entirely on your own growth, your own path, and your own potential. Not for a week, not for a month, but for the next year, the next 5 years, the next decade. Can you picture the person you'd become? The peace you'd feel, the confidence you'd carry. This isn't just about short-term gains. This is about building a life of sustained fulfillment, success, and inner contentment. When you make the decision to focus on yourself, you're setting the foundation for something far more valuable than temporary achievements. You're building a life that isn't shaken by external circumstances or other people's opinions. Take a moment to reflect on the people who've made a significant change in their lives, not by chasing someone else's definition of success, but by committing to their own growth. There's a story I think of often of a man who had spent his whole life trying to live up to the expectations of others. He compared himself to his colleagues. He felt inadequate in his family, and his self-worth was entirely dependent on what others thought of it. He spent years chasing after things that, in the end, left him empty. One day, he decided to make a shift. He stopped worrying about what others expected of him and started asking himself, what do I want? What would make me proud? It wasn't an overnight transformation, but slowly, things began to change. He focused on improving himself one small step at a time. And after a few years, he was almost unrecognizable, more confident, more at peace, more successful by his own. His relationships improved because he wasn't looking for others to validate him. His work became more meaningful because he wasn't trying to outperform anyone. He was simply doing his best. That's the power of focusing on yourself. It's not about a dramatic, flashy change. It's about consistent, steady growth. And that growth compounds over time It's the difference between constantly chasing after the next big thing and quietly, confidently building a life that feels right for you. The long-term impact of this mindset is profound. You'll find that not only do you achieve more, but you're also happier along the way. You're not living in the shadow of someone else's expectations. You're living for yourself, and that brings a sense of fulfillment that can't be shaken. So let me ask you this, are you willing to make that commitment today? Are you ready to stop looking at everyone else and start focusing on yourself? Are you ready to become the best version of you, even if no one else is watching? Because here's the truth. The rewards, the real lasting rewards, come when you do. When you focus on your own growth, your own peace, your own path, you unlock a kind of power that can't be found in comparison or competition. It's a quiet strength that carries you through the toughest times, that keeps you grounded when the world around you is chaotic. And it doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need approval from anyone else. It just requires a commitment from you, a commitment to show up for yourself every day, even in the smallest ways. A commitment to stop comparing, stop competing, and start cultivating your own life. The question is, are you ready to make that commitment? Are you ready to focus on yourself starting today? Because if you are, everything can change. Not all at once, but little by little, day by day. You'll look back in a year, in 5 years, and realize just how far you've come. You'll realize that the rewards were never in trying to outdo others. They were always in the growth that comes from staying true to yourself. So I ask you again, are you willing to be the best version of yourself, even if no one is watching? Because that's where the true rewards are found. And once you tap into that, the rest of the world will follow. You won't need to chase after success. It will find you. Focus on yourself and everything else will fall into place.